Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Why do we always come here?
I guess we'll never know.
It's like a kind of torture to have to watch the show.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk about the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients really that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark. I'm trying not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a movie made. We are going back to the late 1970s. We're bringing the Muppets back. Here's a little snippet of a song that headlines 1979's The Muppet Movie.
Why are there so many songs about rainbows, and what's on the other side? Rainbows are visions, but only illusions, and rainbows have nothing to hide. So we've been told, and some choose to believe it. I know they're wrong, wait and see. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me.
And that was Rainbow Connection from 1979's The Muppet Movie, directed by James Frawley, written by Jack Burns and Jerry Jewell, starring Jim Henson, Frank Oz, Jerry Nelson, Richard Hunt, Dave Goltz, Charles Dunning and Austin Pendleton, and then a whole host of cameos that it would take me a podcast and a half just to list, I think. So the 1970s were peak time for the Muppets on television. The Muppet Show was an absolute sensation. That it was primarily based in London, that the workshop creating the Muppets was one of those in New York, but the Muppet Show was a UK production, really, with Jim Henson and his team based over Elstree Studios in the UK, creating the show, as well as a bunch of other really quite amazing creations. The creativity of all of this just continues to astound me. But the conversations got going when the Muppets really became a huge hit about the idea of a film. And it was in 1977 that Jim Henson seriously began considering the idea of a movie. Not, though, the idea of taking the Muppet Show and just putting a version of that on film, but he wanted to draw the camera back a little bit. He really liked the idea, as the film's eventual director James Frawley would relate to American Cinematographer magazine, of the flip side of the Muppet Show. A lot more of the behind the scenes working and the characters who set about making that television show. So the idea really was, let's take the Muppets out into the real world. And Jim Henson, a very persuasive and very creative man, took the idea to the British television company ATV that was having an awful lot of success with the show. This was headed up by the famous British movie and television mogul Lord Lou Grade. Now, he had the funds to make a Muppet film happen, but he was going to be taking a bit of persuading to get there. Henson, though, was absolutely convinced, and it's worth noting that not everybody was, that the Muppets could work on a cinema screen, but the venture would not be a cheap one. By 1970 standard, the proposed budget of $8 million was an awful lot of money, If you think that like 5 years later, something like Gremlins was costing $11 million, the average Disney movie was costing $1 million or $2 million at this point, Henson was asking for a lot of funds to make a family film. Now, in a retrospective look-back piece that was published on IGN a few years ago, Cheryl Henson, Jim's daughter and president of the Jim Henson Foundation, talked about how my father was very excited about doing a full-length feature film. It was really major for him because his work up until then was television. He'd done a couple of short films, but this was really the first opportunity to participate in a major feature film. And it was exciting. Henson really liked the idea of directing a movie. Jerry Jewell really liked the idea of writing a movie. And Henson's persuasive powers had not left him. Helped by the stellar ratings and popularity of The Muppet Show, Lord Lou Grade did indeed agree to stump up the money. But what Grade didn't know was Henson was percolating two movie ideas at the same time that to a degree he would develop in tandem. The one that was known, the one on the surface, was a Muppets film. The other was what would become The Dark Crystal, which is very much a story for another time. But it is worth noting that the workaholic Henson was not just making The Muppet Show at this point. He was also involved in Fraggle Rock, one or two other TV projects as well. But rather than just develop one feature film, he started the work developing two, and he threw himself into preparation for them. Now, while this was going on, they were still delivering regular episodes of The Muppet Show. And in fact, it wouldn't be until nearly the middle of 1978 that there was enough of a gap in Jim Henson's schedule that they could seriously look at where to take the Muppet movie. By that stage, a man called Jack Burns had been brought in to work on the screenplay as well. Now, apparently the regular screenwriter, Jerry Jewell, was not particularly thrilled at the idea of someone else coming in, but there was an awful lot of work going on at this point, and it just needed to be evenly split around a little bit. And Burns was not new to The Muppet Show. He had an extensive comedy background before he came to it. He'd been writing for the series since the first series of the programme anyway, but he would initially take the lead on the script for the film, and then by the spring of 1978 Jerry Jewell was brought in to kind of polish that up a little bit. The idea being to focus on a road movie that happened to feature the Muppets, and by 1978 Paul Williams had been recruited to work on songs for the film as well. Williams's songbook for the Muppets, I mean, just look at Muppet Christmas Carol, is pretty much without parallel, I would suggest. And so the hive of activity at Elstree Studios saw Sesame Street, Dark Crystal, The Muppet Show, The Muppet Movie, all in various stages of development. For Paul Williams and the songs, interestingly, Jim Henson said he didn't want to hear the demos of the songs that Williams was putting together. It's almost unthinkable, this idea now, that Henson was just like, you write the songs and I'll hear them when we go into the studio to record them. That I can't imagine he went in completely cold and with no idea what he was going to get musically. But the level of trust in Paul Williams to develop the music and the songs and that wonderful opening number, Rainbow Connection, was, I mean, just really kind of unthinkable today. Jim Henson had wanted to direct the Muppet movie, particularly over time. That's very much become a known thing. But there was a broader appreciation that this was significantly scaling up the operation, that this was going to be a very, very big endeavour to do. And it was, with the Muppet Show also in production, he was persuaded that an external director who knew their way a bit more around the movies was probably a good idea. And so that's how a man called James Frawley got involved. Now, Frawley's his CV up until that point, he certainly had some grounding in television, particularly the Monkees TV show that he directed nearly 30 episodes of in the 1960s. So he knew that he could move fast, but also he'd done feature-length stuff as well. And so he was recruited in to direct the film. Henson never particularly happy with this. But also the decision was made to shoot the movie in California because this was going to have to be done on exteriors. The whole idea of the Muppets in and around Hollywood and California, they were going to have to shoot in California. And the challenges here were really, really, really strong. So in came Frawley, and Frawley, as Cheryl Henson told IGN, brought a really great sense of humour. And she did explain the studio felt because there were so many new challenges to this film, they wanted an accomplished director that had a track record. But Cheryl Henson insisted my father had a lot of input on every single scene. I mean, he was in lots of them, to be fair. And she talked about how Frawley had a really great sense of wackiness from his background with the Monkees and a no-holds-barred, let's just do it flavour that really helped to make the film work. Now, there was an intense period of preparation that took place between May and June 1978 that saw Jim Henson jetting between Los Angeles, where the film sets were being put together, New York, where Muppets were being constructed, where also development work was happening, and London, which was the base for the ongoing television projects as well. So Henson was having meetings with James Frawley. They were working out the complications of shooting the Muppets on film stock for the first time, on 35mm. This hadn't happened before. How would the Muppets, the actual physical puppets, stand up to the scrutiny of 35mm? And so what they did was they got into Jim Henson's car. James Frawley came along. They took camera. And they went and they shot some test footage in the countryside. And in the end, after capturing around 15 minutes of material that way, they realised that this could work. This was going to work, that it was going to require a lot of ingenuity just to make sure that the puppeteers were hidden. But they could convincingly make it look like a Muppet was driving the car. And so there were signs that this was going to click. And a good job too, because filming was set to begin on the 5th of July, 1978. Now, this was, it was a taxing shoot, 87-day shoot for the movie that was primarily on location with some studio work. But also it relied on a lot of things working. Primarily the operating of the Muppets themselves. Now, in a studio environment, they knew that they could put crevices in the set. They could build trenches. They could put holes. They could build just like little priest holes, really, that they could hide the puppeteers in. But when you're shooting around California and New Mexico in the outside, well, it took a whole collection of tricks just to keep the puppeteers out of the view of the camera. It is worth noting that there was no post-production effects work or anything that was done on this. They went into the Muppet movie knowing that whatever they wanted to achieve, a Muppet riding a bike, for instance, had to be done in camera on the day because there wasn't an effects department that was going to clean this up. Now, I was really, really fortunate to go onto the set of a Muppets film once upon a time, one of my favourite days of my working life. And I went onto the set of Muppets Most Wanted and saw how they were operating the Muppets on that particular shoot, and that there were a lot of rods in view of the camera, and it was just pretty well accepted that after the production they would just do a little bit of CG work and paint out the rods. Easy, not the biggest job in the world. That was not available here. They couldn't have rods operating the puppets. They had to do every possible trick they could come up with to work out just how to keep these human beings out of sight. Now, Brian J. Jones wrote a terrific biography of Jim Henson, published by Ebury Publishing. Hugely recommend it. He also did a really good book on George Lucas as well. But he talks in his Jim Henson biography just about some of the tricks that they were using to keep people hidden, about how people would have to be rolling onto their backs. They'd have to be sat on chairs that had special wheels on. They had to squeeze into pits that had to be dug in locations. And then, I will come to the bit where Jim Henson's shooting Rainbow Connection in a minute. The practicalities of all of this meant that they could realistically shoot about 1 minute of footage a day, and they weren't wasting the footage. That most of the time sets had to be built 5 feet raised up or with 5 feet underneath just to put the operators in there. And they were adopting the techniques that allowed them to make the Muppet Show on television so quickly. That was why they minimised so much of the post-production work. For Frawley, some of the most difficult sequences to capture involved the Muppets driving around in cars, and there was no textbook really of techniques that they could copy to do this. They were inventing stuff as they were going, so that test drive out into the country ahead of production proved very, very fruitful. But again, it's hiding people in certain places. As you would expect, it's just like any gap that the camera wasn't seeing, there was generally a human being in it. As discussed in Brian J. Jones's book, nobody had taken Fozzie Bear and Miss Piggy and Kermit and put them in a Studebaker. And the way they achieved that was they had 4 puppeteers and their monitors scrunched together in the front seat just under the dashboard. There was no room in that particular sequence for a driver in the car. And so what James Frawley and his team came up with was a special way of rigging the car so that it could actually be driven from the boot of the car by a stunt driver who was then having to watch the road on a monitor. Incredible levels of ingenuity and practical nous, really, that got this material in the can. Nothing compared to the Rainbow Connection opening of the film. Now, I played you a bit of the song there, but if you're unfamiliar with the Muppet movie, this is where the film opens and the camera swoops over a swamp, and in the middle of the swamp there is Kermit the Frog surrounded by water, effortlessly seemingly playing this song. Well, of course, there had to be a human being in the midst of that, and that human being was Jim Henson, who was pretty much underwater operating Kermit the Frog. Also the fact that the camera was shooting from above and swooping down over, the hiding of Henson in that shot was just no mean feat. And so they basically had to put a tank in the pond for Henson to sit in. And as Jones's book would reflect, for Jim Henson, it was like being, quote, buried alive, a tank in water, that Henson was there up to 3 hours at a time, absolutely scrunched in. And he was put in there with a monitor. Then he still needed to see what was going on. He had to have a copy of the script, but he had to be scrunched up to the point that where he came out of the tank, it would take several minutes to get all the feeling back in his limbs. And that particular opening sequence took up 5 days alone of the 87-day shoot of the movie. It is an incredible bit of physical filmmaking, and really watching it now, I mean, it just still stacks up, completely still stacks up. That 87-day schedule also needed to accommodate, and this is why shooting in California was a good idea, over 20 cameo appearances as well. I mean, Orson Welles is in the midst of this. But then it was the case of the draw of the Muppets was such that people just said yes. So it was a taxing and physical shoot. And I mean, there are different angles on it about how happy or otherwise it was. So Brian Henson would go on to direct Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island. And he talked, I mean, he was just a child really at the time. He just talked about the whole family was there in Los Angeles when we shot it. We had a cool, really weird, funky Mulholland Drive house. We had a pool you could swim into the living room. It had a hydraulic diving board. And he said, my whole memory of that period was going to the set pretty much every day. I was too young to be working on anything, but I loved hanging out with the puppeteers. And he said Richard Hunt was one of my best friends, so I'd always hang out with him. Now, Brian Henson also remembered the fact that there was an Emmett Otter special that the Henson Company had done, and that was the first time Kermit was seen riding a bike. And he just talked about what a technical leap it was to show a full Muppet body performing that action. And every major release afterwards featuring Kermit upped his bike game, including the bike sequence in the Muppet movie. Now, Dave Goltz would talk about the shoot as well, and he said he talked to IGN about this, and he just said this was the bit where we had to start using radio-controlled Muppets. Jim was very visually driven, so as the producer, he was able to have a lot of influence on how it was shot, even though he wasn't directing the film himself. However, for James Frawley, he would talk about that it was a very unhappy set. And this is an interview that actor Austin Pendleton gave to the AV Club. And in that interview, he described how James Frawley was, quote, very unhappy directing that movie. And he said, I noticed that was the only time the Muppet people used an outside person to direct a Muppet movie. They never did that again. After that, it was either Jim Henson or Frank Oz. And I'd like to have been in one of those because those sets were very harmonious, but this was not. Now, he didn't go into particular detail of that, but it does slightly go against the otherwise narrative that comes out about this being a calmer production. Turns out there were things bubbling behind the scenes that just weren't as upbeat as they may appear. There was also a huge sequence at the end that would require over 200 Muppets. Nearly every puppet that they had available was required for this moment. They all had to be singing, they all had to be moving, they couldn't just be static, and every single one of them would need an operator. And puppeteering is such a niche expertise that a call had to go out to see people who had the talent, really, that they would be able to do this. And in the end, they had around 150 performers operating all of those puppets. They used a bit of ingenuity and shooting in parts and stuff like that. Tim Burton was said to have been one of the performers, but to capture the very, very populated sequence at the end. At the end of October, the film was wrapping up, but there was no stopping at all for the Henson team because it was straight back to London to make 6 more Muppet Show episodes. But the Muppet movie was now scheduled for release in summer 1979, but there was still television to attend to because season 4 of The Muppet Show would start shooting in April 1979. So all the writing and preparation had to be done for then. And that was at the point where promotion for the movie was ramping up as well. But Lord Lou Grade, a very, very savvy character, of course, well, he smelt a hit. And I mean, as much as the film cost $8 million to make, he put in a further $6 million just to promote it. He felt that they were onto something. In the US too, the CBS network put on a 1-hour television special called The Muppets Go Hollywood. And it was promoting the fact that a month down the line, a big Muppets film was going to be coming out. And I mean, it went before the critics, and the critics, well, they had eyes and ears and really, really went for the movie. That the joy of the Muppets, the songs, the taking them out of their natural environment as well, the wit of it. There were very few moments that just didn't work, and there were very few moments that really attracted any kind of critical ire, really. That even though it wasn't flat out unanimous praise for the film, the response to it was incredibly, incredibly warm and continues to be warm. It's slightly snootier in the UK perhaps, but still on the whole the response was strong, and the film opened to good money as well. Now, I don't have specific opening weekend totals for the Muppet movie, certainly going back to 1979. It did open in America on June the 22nd, 1979. It actually opened in the UK first on May the 31st, 1979. In both the UK and the US, the film was a very, very, very solid hit. Its total box office gross was 65.2 million in the end, and that was just, to my understanding, in the US as well. And if we look at the box office chart, well, the Muppet movie stands as the 10th highest grossing film of the year. The highest grossing film in America that year was Kramer versus Kramer, and the films that were around, the Amityville Horror, Rocky II, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Alien, Apocalypse Now, 10, The Jerk and Moonraker outgrossed it. However, the kind of films that it then in turn outgrossed, well, they included Meatballs, Escape from Alcatraz, Manhattan, all that jazz, The Black Hole, Steven Spielberg's 1941, Hal Ashby's masterpiece to my eyes, Being There was that year, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. I mean, this is the kind of stuff I'm all about. Life of Brian was out that year. But the Muppet movie was one of the top 10 films of the year. It also was, to my understanding, the very first film that ITC Films introduced on the then burgeoning, really, just starting to come through home video format. But my favourite, I guess one of my favourite stories about the Muppet movie was how when it went over to New Zealand, it was censored for what was described as its, quote, gratuitous violence. Now, I dug into this a little bit, and there is a sequence that takes place in the Muppet movie in El Sleazo Cafe, and Fozzie Bear in that particular sequence, I love Fozzie Bear, finds himself in particular trouble. He makes a joke about the size of a sailor. It was the 1970s, and a sailor in the crowd does not take this particularly well. What the problem was for the New Zealand ratings board was then a shot of said sailor with a broken bottle. It wasn't the comment about his weight, and nor was it the fact that someone shot a gun in the direction of Fozzie Bear. It was the implication of this broken bottle, and the New Zealand Classification Office duly insisted on a cut due to the film's gratuitous violence. That was the quote, and the change had to be made. Now, as I understand from Film Stories reader Scott Johnston, the New Zealand in the 1970s was a bit full on when it came to censorship, particularly of family material. So perhaps to people in New Zealand, I am not one, I can't speak with expertise there, it was less of a surprise than for someone just like me looking at it. It is worth noting also there are a couple of cuts of the Muppet movie out there that the original cinema release in the UK was actually about 97 minutes long, but now the version of the movie that's around comes in around 5-6 minutes shorter than that. It was extended versions of scenes that have just been kind of pulled back. The bottle moment you get, whichever version you get, you're going to see the bottle. A few gags are taken out. There's a car chase that's gone, and there's a longer version of the "I hope that something better comes along" song, and a little bit of reaction around Orson Welles' appearance in the film. Those are the kind of things that are not seen in the commonly distributed version of the Muppet movie today. Now, of course, the Muppet movie, not only would it be a big hit, it remains a family favourite, and it kick-started the Muppets on the big screen. It didn't take long to follow it up either. I mean, the success of the television show was continuing too, so perhaps not a surprise. But as implied before, they brought it a bit more in-house, that Jim Henson would finally get to make his feature directorial debut with 1981's The Great Muppet Caper, and then Frank Oz would take the reins for 1984's The Muppets Take Manhattan. And meanwhile, the Henson team were experimenting with other parts of cinema, and so both Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, which Labyrinth I've covered before on this podcast, appeared in this really fruitful creative period for the company and the individuals involved. The Muppet movie is a standout, I think. I absolutely love the film, and even if this doesn't inspire you to go back and watch it, I do just suggest just go and watch that opening sequence. Just watch Kermit the Frog in the middle of that swamp singing the beautiful song put together by Paul Williams that Jim Henson pretty much heard for the first time on the day it was being laid down. And then as you watch the scene, just imagine Jim Henson under the water, cramped in a box, looking at a monitor, reading a script and delivering one of the most heartfelt performances in a family movie in a very long time. Love it. As always, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices. If you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways you can do so. You can support it financially at Patreon, patreon.com/SimonBrew. If you put money in the pot there, you get the podcast early, you get it ad-free as well. You find out the gossip of what I'm up to behind the scenes, costing you absolutely zero. If you could subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, that would be hugely appreciated. Likewise, if you could leave a review, ideally a hugely positive review for podcasts such as this, One Person in a Room. It's the kind of stuff that's absolute gold dust, and I can't thank you enough to everyone who not just listens to this podcast, I mean, thank you for doing that, but also supports it in lots of other ways. I know lots of you have my back, and it's hugely appreciated. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. Film Stories is at Film Stories. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories online, youtube.com/Film Stories. You'll find us there. Or if you want our print magazines, store.filmstories.co.uk is where you'll find those. We also still have some Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham. We are behind, along with our partners at Plumeria Pictures, the UK Blu-ray debut of those 2 fantastic 1980s movies. And finally, our website, filmstories.co.uk. We're doing a non-clickbait movie, TV and games website. Imagine that. And given the battle to get things like that noticed by algorithms in the modern era, every click we get off you really, really helps. But as always, I've outstayed my welcome. I bored you for too long. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care. Bye bye.